Episode 129. Are children being deliberately overprescribed psychiatric medication? Welcome back to the Conspiracy Theory Analyst. I'm Robin. In the United States, approximately 7 million children between the ages of 5 and 17 have been diagnosed with ADHD. More than a third of them are prescribed stimulant medication. Antidepressant prescriptions for children and adolescents have risen steadily for decades. Antipsychotic prescriptions for children, including for conditions they were not originally designed to treat, have increased significantly. The question for tonight is not whether psychiatric medication helps children with genuine diagnoses. For many, it does, and the evidence supports this. The question is a different one: whether the dramatic rise in psychiatric diagnoses and medications among children reflects genuine improvements in clinical recognition, or whether financial incentives, pharmaceutical influence, and a medicalization of normal childhood behavior have led to a system in which children are being drugged in numbers that serve industry interests rather than clinical need. This is not a fringe question. It has been raised by the Make America Healthy Again Commission, by investigative journalists at major newspapers, by independent child psychiatrists, and by parents across the political spectrum. Detailed explanation: ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, was formally recognized as a psychiatric diagnosis in 1980. Ritalin, the first stimulant medication for ADHD, was approved for children in 1962. Since 1980, ADHD diagnosis rates in the United States have risen consistently. Today, approximately 11.3% of U.S. children aged 5 to 17 have been diagnosed with ADHD at some point. In September 2025, the Make America Healthy Again Commission, operating under HHS Secretary RFK Jr., published a report raising concerns that too many children were being treated with prescription medication for ADHD. The report described what it characterized as a potential overprescribing problem. CHAD, the leading ADHD advocacy organization, responded publicly, arguing that the report relied on a narrow and unrepresentative dataset and that ADHD remains a substantially undertreated condition in many communities. In November 2025, the Wall Street Journal published an investigation suggesting that millions of children entered a dangerous medication cascade after starting ADHD treatment, receiving additional medications to manage the side effects of the first. CHAD again responded, arguing the analysis relied on a high-risk Medicaid subgroup whose multiple prescriptions reflected multiple pre-existing complex conditions rather than ADHD medication causing cascading problems. This is the terrain of tonight's episode, not a simple story of industry corruption, but a genuinely contested clinical and policy debate with significant implications for millions of children. Core elements of the concern: the first element is the diagnostic expansion argument. ADHD criteria have been revised and broadened multiple times since the 1980s. Each revision has tended to include a larger percentage of the population. Critics, including some psychiatrists and psychologists, argue that the boundaries of ADHD have been drawn to include normal variation in childhood behavior and attention, particularly in boys, who are diagnosed at rates roughly 3 times higher than girls. The question of whether ADHD is overdiagnosed is genuinely debated within psychiatry, not merely outside it. The second element is pharmaceutical industry influence on diagnosis. Major pharmaceutical companies have a documented history of funding research, medical education, and advocacy organizations in ways that influence clinical practice. Investigations have found that pharmaceutical companies funded studies, speakers, and continuing medical education programs that emphasize the benefits of ADHD medication and minimize concerns. The financial relationship between the pharmaceutical industry and the psychiatry profession has been the subject of congressional hearings and academic criticism. The third element is the geographic variation problem. ADHD diagnosis and medication rates vary dramatically by geography within the United States, not in ways that reflect known variation in the biological basis for the disorder, but in ways that reflect local prescribing culture, insurance structures, and socioeconomic factors. A child in one state is substantially more likely to be diagnosed and medicated than an identical child in another state. This variation is difficult to explain if diagnosis is being made on purely clinical grounds. The fourth element is the youngest child in class effect. Research has consistently found that children who are the youngest in their school year, and therefore the least developmentally mature compared to their older classmates, are significantly more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD and prescribed stimulants. In some studies, the effect accounts for a substantial proportion of ADHD diagnoses. This finding suggests that at least some ADHD diagnoses reflect developmental immaturity misidentified as disorder. Evidence for and against the evidence for genuine overprescribing is mixed and context-dependent. The youngest in-class effect is robust across multiple studies and countries. Geographic variation in diagnosis rates is documented. Pharmaceutical industry influence on psychiatric practice has been documented in congressional hearings and academic literature. These are real concerns supported by real evidence. The evidence against the strong conspiracy framing that children are being deliberately drugged to serve pharmaceutical profits includes the finding from Columbia University Medical Center that prescription rates for stimulants and antidepressants for children do not exceed known prevalence rates for the conditions they treat. 1 in 30 teenagers received antidepressant prescriptions. 1 in 12 has a depressive episode. Nearly a third of diagnosed ADHD children take no medication at all. The population-level data does not clearly support a system of mass overprescription. ADHD is one of the most thoroughly researched conditions in child psychiatry. When appropriately diagnosed and treated, stimulant medication reduces risks of academic failure, accidental injury, substance misuse, and other negative outcomes. The evidence base for its effectiveness in genuine ADHD is strong. What is genuinely established is that diagnosis and prescription rates vary in ways that reflect factors beyond clinical need, and that pharmaceutical industry influence has shaped aspects of how ADHD is understood and treated. Whether this rises to deliberate overprescription as a systemic strategy is the question the evidence does not clearly resolve. Argument in favor of concerned critics argue that the youngest in-class effect alone, demonstrating that relative developmental immaturity is being treated as a disorder, is evidence of systematic overdiagnosis on a large scale. They point to the documented pharmaceutical industry influence on research and education as evidence that the clinical framework for ADHD has been shaped by financial interests. And they argue that prescribing a controlled stimulant substance to millions of children in a system where diagnosis rates vary by geography rather than biology constitutes a public health problem regardless of intent. They also note that the medication cascade concern raised by the Wall Street Journal, children receiving multiple psychiatric medications to manage the effects of the first, reflects a real pattern that Chad's response did not fully address. Arguments against the conspiracy framing child psychiatrists and advocacy organizations argue that the dominant public narrative about ADHD overprescription has caused its own harm, deterring parents from seeking diagnoses for children who need them, and leading to the stigmatization of a condition with a well-established neurological basis. Studies consistently find that more children with genuine ADHD receive inadequate treatment than receive unnecessary treatment. They also note that the youngest in-class effect, while real, affects a minority of diagnoses and does not account for the majority of ADHD prescribing. Geographic variation in diagnosis rates reflects healthcare access disparities as much as overdiagnosis. Rural and low-income communities tend to have lower diagnosis rates, not higher ones. Public opinion and broader impact. The ADHD debate is one of the most heated in contemporary medicine, touching questions of childhood, neurodiversity, pharmaceutical influence, parental choice, and the boundaries of what constitutes a disorder versus a trait. In 2025, it reached the level of a federal government commission report, a major newspaper investigation, and a public dispute between advocacy organizations and government health officials. What the debate reflects is a genuine and important question. In a system where pharmaceutical companies profit from diagnosis, where doctors are influenced by industry-funded education, and where children cannot fully advocate for their own interests, how do we ensure that medication serves children's well-being rather than adult or institutional interests? Conclusion: are children being deliberately overprescribed psychiatric medication? The evidence points to a system with genuine structural problems, pharmaceutical industry influence, diagnostic criteria that have been expanded over time, and prescription rates that vary by geography in ways that reflect factors beyond clinical need. Whether this constitutes deliberate overprescription as a strategic policy is the question the evidence does not clearly answer. The population-level data does not support the conclusion that most diagnosed children are wrongly medicated. But the youngest in-class effect and geographic variation suggest that a meaningful minority may be. For believers in the stronger conspiracy framing, the pharmaceutical industry's documented influence and the scale of the prescribing are the evidence. For clinicians who treat ADHD, the greater problem is undertreated children whose genuine condition goes unaddressed because of stigma and concern about overmedication. What is certain is this: millions of children are taking psychiatric medication. Some of them undoubtedly need it. Some of them may not. And the system that decides which is which has documented financial conflicts of interest that it has never fully resolved. This is the Conspiracy Theory Analyst. I'm Robin. If tonight's episode made you think, please rate and follow on Spotify. Tomorrow on the Conspiracy Theory Analyst, the Titanic conspiracy. Was the wrong ship deliberately sunk? That's next.